The snow had crusted overnight, sealing the gravel pull-off in silence, when a county surveyor noticed disturbed frost near a drainage culvert, the air sharp with December iron, evidence flags trembling as deputies realized this was not weather damage but the beginning of a long, frozen reckoning for everyone involved. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. Minnesota in late December has a way of slowing everything down, even the passage of time. Roads glaze over, fields lie dormant, and small towns retreat indoors, their routines shaped by heaters, early sunsets, and the calendar's quiet approach toward Christmas. In 2002, that rhythm was broken outside the city of St. Cloud, where the discovery near a rural culvert set in motion an investigation that would stretch across decades. The woman found there was later identified as Emily Rose Larson, 22 years old, a college student home for the holidays, known to her family as dependable and cautious, the sort who called before driving anywhere after dark. Emily had been reported missing 2 days earlier, on December 22. Her mother contacted Stearns County authorities when Emily failed to return from a short drive meant to clear her head after finishing a late shift at a local retail store. Missing person flyers went up quickly, photocopied in black and white, taped to grocery store windows and gas station doors. Her photograph showed a young woman with light hair pulled back, expression calm, unaware of how widely her face would soon circulate. At the time, there was no immediate sign of a crime. Her car had not been found, and there were no known threats or recent conflicts noted in the initial report. The discovery scene was treated with caution. Deputies cordoned off the culvert and surrounding ditch line, marking tire impressions and footprints pressed into the frozen soil. The cold preserved details while complicating others, locking the ground into a hard shell. Investigators worked methodically, documenting the scene with photographs and measurements before any removal took place. Emily's identification came through personal effects and later confirmation by dental records, a process conducted with restraint and adherence to protocol. The medical examiner's preliminary assessment indicated exposure to the elements played a role in her death, but there were additional indicators that raised questions. There were no signs of prolonged struggle at the scene, suggesting the location was not where events began. The absence of certain personal items pointed toward the likelihood that Emily had been transported. Time of death was estimated within a narrow window, aligning with the night she disappeared, when temperatures dropped below zero and roads emptied early as families settled in for the holidays. Public attention intensified as Christmas approached. Local newspapers ran measured headlines, avoiding speculation while acknowledging fear spreading through the community. Churches mentioned Emily during prayer requests. Candlelight vigils were held, their flames flickering against the wind, attended by neighbors who had never met her but recognized the vulnerability the case represented. For older residents, men who had lived decades in the region and remembered when doors were rarely locked, the case felt like a rupture in the assumed order of things. Investigators reconstructed Emily's final movements. Surveillance footage from the retail store confirmed her leaving alone shortly before closing. Traffic cameras along Highway 23 showed her vehicle heading west, consistent with her stated intention to drive briefly before returning home. Her car was later found abandoned in a snow-covered rest area several miles away, the keys missing, the fuel tank nearly full. There were no signs of forced entry. The vehicle was processed carefully, gloved hands collecting fibers and swabs, each item logged and sealed for analysis. Early interviews focused on those closest to Emily. Family members provided timelines and access to her phone records. Friends described her plans for Christmas Eve dinner, and a New Year's gathering she had helped organize. Coworkers were questioned about interactions during her last shift. No one recalled anything unusual. The absence of an obvious suspect slowed progress, and as January arrived, the case cooled in the public eye even as detectives continued their work. Winter turned to spring, but the file grew thicker rather than closing. Forensic results trickled in. Fibers recovered from Emily's clothing did not match her vehicle interior. A partial fingerprint lifted from the car's exterior failed to match anyone in state databases at the time. Phone records revealed a brief incoming call shortly before she left work, from a prepaid phone later discarded. The number led nowhere, another loose end filed away. Years passed. The case was reassigned more than once as personnel changed. Each transfer involved careful review, senior detectives guiding younger investigators through the existing evidence. Emily's parents aged visibly in follow-up photographs taken during anniversaries of her disappearance, yet they continued to attend meetings, asking the same measured questions, hoping for incremental progress rather than miracles. Thanksgiving and Christmas marked the passage of time more sharply than calendars ever could. In 2018, advances in forensic technology prompted a renewed review of unsolved cases in Minnesota. Emily Larson's file was among those selected. Evidence stored in cold archives was re-examined, including fibers and biological samples previously too degraded or limited for testing. Modern DNA analysis produced a partial profile from material recovered beneath Emily's fingernails, suggesting brief contact. That profile was entered into national databases, initially yielding no match. Investigators broadened their scope, revisiting old tips with fresh eyes. A report from 2002 regarding a suspicious vehicle near the rest area resurfaced. At the time, it lacked sufficient detail. Now, combined with improved mapping software and archived weather data, detectives reconstructed traffic patterns that night. They identified a cluster of vehicles that passed through the area within a narrow time frame, including a delivery van registered to a regional contractor. The contractor's records led to a former employee, a man who had lived intermittently in central Minnesota in the early 2000s and later moved out of state. His name had never appeared prominently in the case file. Further investigation revealed a minor arrest from 2003 in another state, unrelated but sufficient to have placed his DNA into a system that was later linked through familial searching. In 2021, a partial match emerged, subtle but statistically significant. Surveillance and background checks followed, conducted quietly to avoid alerting the suspect. Detectives compared timelines, employment records, and travel logs. The suspect had been scheduled for overnight routes near St. Cloud during the week Emily disappeared. Old maintenance logs placed his van near the rest area. A search warrant was obtained, and discarded items from his current residence were collected. DNA comparison confirmed the match. The arrest in early 2022 was carried out without incident. News spread quickly through the community, many expressing shock that a case so old could still move forward. The suspect was charged with second-degree murder, the evidence built on forensic linkage, circumstantial reconstruction, and his presence in critical locations. Court proceedings unfolded methodically, with expert testimony explaining the science in clear terms. The conviction brought a quiet form of closure. Emily Larson's name appeared once more in headlines, this time alongside words like resolution and accountability. Her family released a brief statement expressing gratitude to investigators who had persisted. In St. Cloud, life continued, seasons turning as they always had, but the case remained a reminder that even in the deepest cold, patient work could eventually bring truth to light. After the arrest became public, the narrative of Emily Rose Larson's disappearance shifted from speculation to verification. and investigators began the painstaking task of explaining, step by step, how a young woman could vanish during a familiar winter drive and remain unresolved for nearly 20 years. For men who had followed the story since the early newspaper reports of 2002, the renewed attention felt heavy, not triumphant. It was a reminder of unfinished business, of how many winters had passed while answers waited in storage rooms and sealed envelopes. In early 2003, the original investigation had already reached a frustrating plateau. Detectives had canvassed rest areas, truck stops, and rural intersections within a 50-mile radius. Snowplow operators were interviewed, their logs checked for anomalies. No one reported seeing a woman in distress that night. Holiday travel patterns complicated witness recall. Christmas traffic had been steady earlier in the evening, then abruptly thinned as temperatures dropped and families stayed home. The darkness arrived early, swallowing details that might have mattered. Emily's car, recovered from the rest area, became the centerpiece of the case. Its condition suggested it had been driven there intentionally rather than abandoned after mechanical failure. There were no skid marks or signs of panic braking. The parking angle was clean, almost careful. Investigators noted this repeatedly in their reports. Someone had taken the time to park properly, despite the cold, despite the circumstances. That detail lingered in the margins of the file for years, unsettling in its quiet implication. The medical examiner's final report in 2003 listed the cause of death as hypothermia, with contributing factors related to restraint and displacement. The language was clinical and spare. There were no sensational findings, only indicators consistent with limited physical contact and exposure. Emily had not wandered off on her own. She had been prevented from leaving a vehicle or enclosed space for a period of time before being left in the Culvert area. This conclusion guided the investigation toward someone with access to transportation and familiarity with the area. In the months following her burial, detectives focused heavily on known offenders and transient populations moving through central Minnesota. Truck drivers were questioned, delivery schedules examined. Tips poured in, many vague, some emotionally charged, few substantiated. Each was logged, evaluated, and filed. Over time, the volume itself became a burden, obscuring more than it clarified. By late 2004, the case was officially classified as cold, though never closed. What preserved it was discipline. Evidence was not discarded. Every item was cataloged according to evolving standards. When storage facilities were upgraded, Emily's case was among those transferred under supervision. Forensic technicians who handled the materials years later noted the care taken by their predecessors, even when technology had not yet caught up to investigative ambition. This continuity mattered more than anyone realized at the time. The renewed review in 2018 began quietly, without press releases or public expectations. A task force assembled to reassess unsolved homicides involving young adults from the late 1990s and early 2000s. Emily's case stood out because of its completeness. There were few gaps, only unanswered questions. Analysts digitized handwritten notes, creating searchable timelines. Whether data was layered over movement maps. Old photographs were enhanced, not to dramatize, but to clarify textures and distances. One overlooked detail resurfaced during this phase. A service receipt found in Emily's car, originally dismissed as routine, indicated a tire rotation performed 2 weeks before her disappearance. The shop employee, interviewed again nearly 2 decades later, remembered her only faintly, but records confirmed her visit. Surveillance footage from the shop no longer existed, but the visit helped confirm the car's mechanical reliability. It reinforced the conclusion that she had not stopped due to vehicle trouble. Attention returned to the rest area. In 2002, Its lighting had been minimal sodium lamps casting uneven pools of yellow across the pavement. Since then, upgrades had improved visibility, but archived photographs showed how shadows dominated the space back then. Detectives stood there in winter coats, years later, recreating sightlines. From certain angles, a large van could idle unnoticed. From others, a person standing beside a car could disappear from view entirely. The suspect's employment records placed him on an overnight route that passed within minutes of the rest area during the critical window. In 2002, this had meant nothing. Dozens of contractors ran similar routes. What changed was the DNA. The partial profile recovered from Emily's fingernails, once too incomplete to pursue, now found resonance through familial searching. The match was not direct at first. It was a statistical whisper pointing toward a family line, not a name. Genealogists working with law enforcement built family trees using public records, birth certificates, and census data. This process took months, each step checked and rechecked to avoid error. Eventually, the line narrowed to a man who had worked in Minnesota briefly before moving south. His subsequent life showed a pattern of instability, short-term employment, and minor legal troubles, none violent enough to draw earlier attention. When investigators followed him, they did so cautiously. There was no rush. Surveillance confirmed his routines. Trash pulls were conducted legally, the contents analyzed with the same restraint that had characterized the case from the beginning. The DNA match, when it came, was decisive. It aligned with the partial profile and excluded all others tested. The probability calculations were explained in internal memos with clarity meant to withstand courtroom scrutiny. During interviews after his arrest, the suspect offered little that altered the evidentiary landscape. His statements were inconsistent with documented movements. He could not account for gaps in his timeline that night. Prosecutors later emphasized this absence rather than any dramatic confession. The case did not hinge on words spoken in an interrogation room, but on years of accumulated, verified facts. For Emily's parents, the arrest reopened wounds long scarred over. They were briefed privately before the announcement. According to investigators, they listened quietly, asking practical questions about process and next steps. There were no public displays of anger or celebration. Their response reflected 2 decades of living with uncertainty, now replaced by the gravity of resolution. As the case moved toward trial, attention turned to presentation. Prosecutors prepared to explain complex forensic advances to a jury without overselling their power. Defense motions challenged timelines and statistical interpretations, as expected. The court allowed the evidence, noting the rigorous chain of custody and peer-reviewed methodologies involved. Outside the courthouse, winter returned again. Snow fell on the same streets where Emily's flyers had once hung. Life in central Minnesota continued with its habitual rhythm, but beneath it ran a current of reflection. The case had waited patiently, through seasons and systems, until the moment when persistence and technology finally aligned. The trial began in the spring session of Stearns County District Court, but the emotional weight of the case was anchored firmly in winter, in December nights that had never loosened their hold on the evidence. Jurors were selected carefully, many of them men and women who remembered the headlines from years earlier, now older, more cautious in their assumptions. The judge emphasized restraint, reminding them that time alone did not imply uncertainty, that facts preserved correctly did not age out of relevance. Prosecutors opened by reconstructing Emily Rose Larson's final week with precision. Employment records showed her scheduled shifts. Bank statements confirmed small, ordinary purchases consistent with holiday preparation. Phone records, sparse by modern standards, placed her movements within narrow margins. Each detail was presented not to dramatize, but to establish normalcy. Emily had not been planning to leave town. She had not been withdrawing money or severing contact. She had been living her life as expected for a 22-year-old woman home for Christmas. The forensic testimony unfolded methodically. Analysts explained how evidence collected in 2002 had been limited by technology rather than mishandled. The partial biological material recovered beneath Emily's fingernails had been preserved in climate-controlled storage, logged and relogged over the years as facilities changed. When modern amplification techniques were applied, the resulting profile was incomplete but viable. Experts detailed how probabilistic genotyping worked, how it accounted for degradation and mixtures, and why the statistical confidence reached the threshold for legal relevance. The defense focused on the absence of eyewitnesses and the passage of time. They questioned whether contamination could have occurred, whether innocent contact might explain the DNA. Prosecutors countered with chain-of-custody documentation spanning 2 decades, showing uninterrupted control. They emphasized that no evidence suggested Emily had ever encountered the defendant through lawful or social means. There were no shared workplaces, no overlapping circles, no reason for his biological material to be present unless contact occurred during the window of her disappearance. Transportation records became another pillar of the case. Maintenance logs from the contractor the defendant worked for in 2002 were entered into evidence. They showed the assigned delivery route, mileage consistent with travel past the rest area where Emily's car was found. Archived fuel receipts placed the vehicle in the vicinity within an hour of her disappearance. Weather reports from that night were displayed, showing temperatures dropping rapidly, reinforcing the narrow time frame in which exposure could become fatal. Investigators testified about the rest area reconstruction. Photographs from 2002 were compared with modern images, illustrating how lighting conditions then would have allowed a large van to idle with minimal visibility. Jurors were shown diagrams indicating sightlines blocked by snowbanks and maintenance buildings. The point was not conjecture, but opportunity. The defendant's vehicle could have been there without drawing attention, particularly on a night when holiday traffic diminished early. The medical examiner's testimony was restrained and factual. Cause and manner of death were explained without embellishment. Hypothermia was identified as the terminal event, with contributing circumstances indicating Emily had been prevented from seeking warmth or assistance. There were no claims beyond what the findings supported. The restraint itself carried weight. It framed the death as the result of deliberate actions followed by abandonment, not accident or misadventure. During the weeks of testimony, Emily's name was spoken repeatedly in the courtroom, always formally, always with care. Her parents attended most sessions, seated behind the prosecution, their presence quiet and consistent. They did not react visibly to testimony, their expression steady, as if conserving energy after years of waiting. For observers, especially older men in the gallery who remembered their own daughters at that age, the scene carried a particular gravity. The defense called experts to critique the familial DNA process, suggesting it risked overreach. Prosecutors responded by outlining safeguards built into the method, court approvals required at each stage, and the narrowing process that reduced thousands of potential relatives to a single viable suspect. They emphasized that the familial search did not establish guilt but guided investigators to corroborating evidence, which was then independently verified. Closing arguments returned to chronology. The prosecution walked the jury through December 22, 2002, hour by hour, Emily leaving work, the brief phone call, her car appearing on traffic cameras, the defendant's vehicle passing through the same corridor, the abandonment of the car, the discovery days later. Each element alone might have seemed inconclusive. Together, they formed a continuous line. The jury deliberated for 4 days. During that time, snow returned to St. Cloud, late-season flakes dusting sidewalks and parking lots. Local news reported cautiously, avoiding speculation. When the verdict was reached, the courtroom filled quietly. The defendant was found guilty of second-degree murder. The decision was unanimous. Sentencing occurred several weeks later. The judge referenced the length of time the case had remained unresolved, noting that delay did not diminish responsibility. The defendant received a sentence consistent with Minnesota guidelines, ensuring he would spend the remainder of his life in custody. There were no outbursts. The proceeding ended as it had begun, formally and without excess. In the months that followed, Emily Larson's case was formally closed. Files were archived one final time, now marked resolved. Investigators involved in the reopening returned to other work, carrying with them the knowledge that persistence had mattered. For the community, the case settled into memory differently than before. It was no longer an open wound but a scar, a reminder of loss and of the slow, deliberate nature of justice. Emily's parents held a small private memorial the following December, marking 20 years since her disappearance. There were no speeches, only the lighting of candles against the cold. In central Minnesota, winters would continue to arrive with the same severity. Holidays would come and go, but one long unanswered question had finally been laid to rest, not with noise or spectacle, but with the quiet certainty of facts proven and a truth, long delayed, finally spoken. In the years after the conviction, the Emily Rose Larson case settled into a different kind of existence, no longer defined by uncertainty, but by reflection. For investigators, it became a reference point in training sessions, an example of how patience and preservation could bridge generations of technology. For the community, especially older residents who remembered the winter of 2002 vividly, it became part of local history, spoken of quietly, usually when the weather turned cold and the days shortened again. The county sheriff's office conducted an internal review once the appeals window closed. There were no procedural failures identified, only limitations imposed by the era in which the crime occurred. Reports noted that early investigators had acted within best practices of the time, preserving evidence that later proved decisive. This acknowledgement mattered. It reinforced trust in institutions that often receive criticism when cases go unsolved for long periods. In this instance, the delay was not neglect but the slow alignment of method and capability. Emily's case also prompted renewed attention to evidence storage statewide. Funding was allocated to upgrade climate control systems in older facilities, ensuring that biological samples from other unsolved cases would remain viable. Administrators cited the Larson investigation directly when making their case before legislators, emphasizing that justice sometimes required decades, not months. The argument resonated, particularly with lawmakers who remembered reading about Emily's disappearance in the early 2000s. For the men who followed true crime through newspapers rather than podcasts, who remembered when missing person notices were printed instead of shared online, the resolution carried a sober reassurance. It affirmed that careful record-keeping and institutional memory still mattered in a digital age. The case did not hinge on a dramatic breakthrough or a last-minute confession. It was solved through accumulation, through details that refused to fade entirely. Emily Larson herself was remembered increasingly as a person rather than a case number. Local papers ran retrospective pieces focusing on her life, her studies, her work ethic, her plans that winter. These articles avoided sentimentality. They described her as she had been known, ordinary in the best sense, grounded, dependable. Friends from college, now middle-aged, shared recollections framed by time, noting how her absence had quietly shaped their own paths. Her parents chose privacy after sentencing, declining interviews beyond a single written statement released through their attorney. In it, they expressed relief rather than closure, acknowledging that while answers had come, loss remained unchanged. They thanked investigators by name, some retired, some still serving, recognizing the continuity of effort across years. The statement ended with a simple hope that other families waiting for answers might see similar persistence applied to their cases. The defendant was transferred to a state correctional facility, where his movements were recorded with the same precision that had ultimately undone him. Appeals were filed and denied in sequence, each ruling reaffirming the admissibility and reliability of the evidence. Court opinions emphasized that advances in forensic science did not invalidate older cases, but enhanced them when applied responsibly. The legal aftermath was quiet, procedural, and final. In St. Cloud, the rest area where Emily's car had been found was renovated again, its layout altered, lighting modernized. There was no marker indicating what had happened there, no plaque or sign. The absence felt appropriate to many locals. The site returned to its original purpose, a place for travelers to stop briefly before continuing on. Those who knew the story understood the significance without needing it named. Each December, local law enforcement departments conducted outreach campaigns reminding residents about winter safety, emphasizing how quickly exposure could become dangerous. While these efforts were broad, not tied to a single case, Emily's story hovered in the background, an unspoken reminder of vulnerability in extreme cold. Officers who gave these talks, some of whom had not yet been in uniform in 2002, understood the lineage of the message. As time moved forward, the case influenced other investigations indirectly. Familial DNA searches, once controversial, gained clearer guidelines and oversight mechanisms. Courts cited the Larson case when discussing proportionality and restraint in their use. The emphasis remained on corroboration, on ensuring that science guided investigation rather than replacing it. This balance became part of standard practice. For older men who had watched the justice system evolve across decades, from paper files to digital databases, the case offered a rare sense of continuity. It demonstrated that while tools changed, the underlying principles did not. Evidence mattered, timelines mattered, patience mattered. The resolution did not erase the past, but it honored it through diligence. Emily Larson's grave in a small Minnesota cemetery was visited quietly on anniversaries. There were no public ceremonies, no media presence. Her name was etched in stone, dates marking a life shorter than expected. Flowers appeared occasionally, left by family or by someone who remembered her face from an old flyer, now yellowed with age in a scrapbook somewhere. The broader cultural attention that briefly returned during the trial faded again, as it always does. New cases emerged, new headlines took precedence. Yet within certain circles, among investigators, attorneys, and those who measure time in winters survived rather than years passed, the Larson case endured as a benchmark. It was cited not for its tragedy alone, but for its resolution. In the end, the story of Minnesota 2002 cold case solved did not conclude with dramatic revelation or public spectacle. It concluded with paperwork finalized, sentences entered, and files closed properly. It ended with a community absorbing the knowledge that answers, even delayed, could still arrive. For Emily Rose Larson, justice came not as a sudden event, but as the final outcome of years of careful, restrained effort. When snow falls now in central Minnesota, covering roads and fields in familiar silence, there is no sense that the past is unresolved. The cold still carries weight, the season still invites reflection, but one question that lingered through countless holidays has been answered. The case stands as proof that time does not automatically erase truth, and that even in the quietest corners of the record room, facts can wait patiently to be found.